Well, welcome. Thanks for joining me this morning, Dr. Phil Norrie. Early on a Sunday morning, really appreciate your time. Mate, we've got heaps to cover. I don't know how we're going to fit it all in, but I don't want to take up too much of your time. You have been very gracious in making yourself available to me as a senior clinical advisor. But our story kind of goes back, oh, geez, when did we first meet? It was something like 2007, I think. I was a medical rep selling
You
strong
came to my
opioids.
surgery.
Yeah, in the Northern Beaches territory, and you've got a medical practice up there in Eleanor Heights. And every time I'd come see you, it was almost like you'd give me more time than any other doctor. I'd just get to sit there with you, and it was like a medical lecture every time I got to come see you. And I was fascinated with the various things that you're up to, including the development of this resveratrol enhanced wine, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But why don't you just share with people like what you do? You're a family medical practitioner, but you're also a medical historian and wine historian. You're a lecturer, a researcher. What are these commitments that you have, and where did it all come from?
Well, when I was at school, I went to Knox. And when I was at school, I loved geography and I loved history. So my main passion was history. And when I wanted to leave school in 1970, we were in the middle of the Vietnam War, and I actually wanted to go to Duntroon, our military academy, the equivalent of West Point, and do a career in the army. But from a historian's point of view, thought the Vietnam War was a stupid war, and I didn't want to end up fighting in Vietnam. So instead of doing Duntroon, I did medicine. And I did medicine at the University of New South Wales, at that time, the biggest university in New South Wales. And I went into general practice because if you specialize, it becomes a bit narrow. Imagine being an orthopedic surgeon and all you do is knee replacements or arthroscopies or something like that. So you're just focused on the one thing. I wanted to be focused on the whole human, the whole body holistically. So I became a GP and I squatted, which is an expression where you find an empty shop and you hang up your shingle and you sit there waiting for your first patient to walk through the door. That was in 1979. So I'd done medicine from 1971 through to 76, a 6-year course. And I'd done an internship at St. Vincent's Hospital in Sydney, and then a junior resident and senior resident Ryde Hospital. Then I did radio doctor work, basically to find out, casing the northern Sydney area to find out where there was a vacancy. And I found a vacancy area in Eleanor. So I squatted there, set up my surgery. And during the day, I used to sleep on the examination couch. And at night, I'd do radio doctor work just to get an income.
Wow.
So then I thought, how can I attract lots of patients quickly? So then I became the doctor for the local Warringah Rats rugby union team. And that way you get not only the patient's family, the girlfriend's family. So within a year, I was flat out as a full-time GP, but an old-fashioned GP who still did house calls and went to nursing homes. Now, after a while, I decided that I wanted to embrace my history side of me, and the government brought in this new rule where we had to do continuing medical education, and every 3 years you had to get so many points. And one way of getting points was to do some medical type degree, which had a medical aspect to it. So I thought I could get a master's degree every 3 years, and every 6 years I could get a PhD. So I said, okay, so from this time, which is about 20 or 30 years ago, I decided to every 3 years to get another degree.
So hang on, just let me interrupt you there, because you're arguably one of the most degree qualified doctors, at least general practitioners in the country. There's something like 3 master's degrees, a PhD, an MD on top of your Bachelor of Medicine, Bachelor of Surgery. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I've just finished doing another master's degree, and I'm started writing my next master's degree. So at the moment, I've got a Bachelor of Medicine, Bachelor of Surgery, 3 masters, a PhD and an MD. I've just handed in another master's, and I've started another master's. So eventually I'll have 5 master's degrees, a PhD and an MD. So that makes me the most degreed doctor in Australia by a country mile.
Jeez.
The emphasis has been on history. So I did
Yeah.
a history of the Macleay family's involvement in the wine industry, and they were the people who had the Macleay Museum at Sydney University. Then I did Leo Buring, Australia's greatest winemaker. Then I did a PhD on the history of wine as a medicine for the past 5,000 years.
Which I've read, by the way. There aren't too many PhD theses that I've read, but I've read yours.
Thank you. Well, it's available on my website, drnorrie.info. And that has turned into a book called A History of Disease. A book called A History of Wine as a Medicine from its beginning in China to the present day. And that book last year won the best drink and history book and health book with the Gourmet Book Awards. And I was going to receive my book award in Paris on the 3rd of June last year. And because of COVID, that got canned, such is life. So that has got that award. Then I did a Master of Arts on the history of Darlinghurst Jail in Sydney. Darlinghurst Jail in Sydney has the historic record of being the first jail in the world to list all the causes of death for the inmates. Prior to that, they just had you executed or you just died. They couldn't care what you died of. It was all for statistics. If you were executed, obviously they had to note that you were executed. But Sydney had at Darlinghurst Jail, the first jail that documented everything. So if you died of tuberculosis or heart failure or whatever. And so I did a history of all those causes of death and the death rates, and showed that you were actually better off being in Darlinghurst Jail than in the general population, just to dispel Charles Dickens' myth that people went to workhouses and jail to die. If you went to Darlinghurst Jail in the mid-1800s, you got clothes, you got things called shoes, which a lot of people never had. You got 3 meals a day, you got a bed. Obviously, it was in a cell, but at least you had a bed with a roof over your head. You had medical treatment. You had the smallpox vaccine, which you probably wouldn't have got when you lived in the general population. So, and you actually got to wash yourself regularly. So all these things meant that your life expectancy was greater in jail than out in the streets. So
that's still often the case. My cousin used to work in the prison system in California, and he was saying that the recidivism rate was so high, oftentimes because people just, it was harder for them to survive out in the world. It was easier for them in jail because of these things that you're talking about. And in particular, if they're dealing with, if they're HIV positive, for example, then they would get all those medications for free whilst they were in jail. So they actually ended up having a better quality of life, at least in terms of their well-being, versus the stress and heartache and everything that's associated with being sick out in a society where they couldn't afford to live a normal life. And
well,
that's in modern times.
In the beginning of Australia's colonisation with the convicts, when they got out here, realised how wonderful it was, because you could get, after you served your term, you could get some land and you could start your own life here as a farmer. So they wrote back to England and Ireland, saying it was pretty good out in Australia. So the crime rate actually went up because people did more petty crimes. Not bad crimes so they were hung, but petty crimes so they became a convict and were sent out to Australia, because back in Ireland or back in England, there was no way they were ever going to own some land, and they were struggling to get clothes and shoes and beds and a roof over their head and regular food. So they committed petty crimes just to get on a convict ship bound for Australia.
Isn't that amazing?
So then I did another degree. I did the Doctor of Medicine degree, and the Doctor of Medicine degree took 8 years part-time, and that was looking at the role of disease at the end of the Bronze Age in the Middle East. One of the great unsolved riddles of ancient history is why the Middle East Bronze Age ended so quickly. It ended over a short 50-year period and is characterized by mass migration of populations and abandonment of cities. Now, unfortunately, ancient historians don't factor in the possibility of disease ending their beloved little empire that they're examining. But for any first-year medical student, if you said to them short time frame, mass migration of population and abandonment of cities, they'd think, gee, there must be a pandemic or a plague or some sort of epidemic causing that. And that's what I investigated. And the two main culprits would be pneumonic plague and smallpox. In Turkey, where you had which was then known as Anatolia, the Hittites, their capital, Hattusa, for example, was just abandoned. There's no sign of it actually being attacked. There's no sign of it being occupied after it was abandoned. And the only conclusion you can draw there is they just abandoned the city, they walked away, and what would cause you to abandon your city? Only an epidemic if everyone was dying. So that became a book. Another
Here we
book,
go. You got
The
another
History
book.
of Disease in Ancient Times, More Lethal Than War. There it is, Palgrave
Hey.
Macmillan. And so that was my 18th book. So yeah, I've published 18 books now.
I think
Mainly
that's what's really cool when I get to interact with you, Phil, is because you do bring a new context to a lot of the things that we traffic in, and we traffic in and consider them truths. And then when you bring a new context, you give new life to that content. I mean, I remember you even sharing with me about the end of slavery in North America, in the US. What did you share with me about that? It had something to do with, was it yellow fever?
Yes. So basically, one of the reasons why slavery ended was not only Lord Shaftesbury and the religious people saying, that slavery is wrong, blah, blah, blah. It was the practical aspect. Nobody wanted to captain or man slave ships because of the high risk of developing yellow fever on the voyage and dying. So who's going to sign up to a slave ship that you're going to obviously get the risk of yellow fever or malaria or whatever from the slaves picked up in Africa and being transported across to America? So one of the great reasons why slavery ended was because of the risk of getting yellow fever. People don't factor in disease, unfortunately. It's very frustrating. The end of World War I, for example, the World War I ended because the German army couldn't counteract the big push by the Allied forces in August 1918 because they were all dying of Spanish flu. So the Spanish flu had a huge contributing factor to the end of World War I. And it's interesting, people wonder why it's called the Spanish flu. It was actually began in American Army camp in Kansas, so it should be called the American flu. And the American troops transported it to the Western Front when they left America and went to Europe. But because there's so many people were dying from the war, the French, the British, the Americans, and the Germans censored anything about extra people dying from flu because it'd be too much for the general public to take on board. It's bad enough taking on board the normal death toll due to warfare without adding on the flu. So the only major country in Europe that had the freedom and wasn't censored and people were dying from the flu at the time was Spain.
Wow.
So Spain reported everyone was dying from this flu, and hence it became known as the Spanish flu. where it should actually be known as the Kansas camp flu, right?
Well, time will tell with regards to the current pandemic. So, I've got one of these chewing the fat sessions scheduled with Professor Linfa Wang from Singapore. So Linfa was my honours supervisor in Geelong at the Australian Animal Health Laboratories. He's since gone on to become the professor and director of the program for emerging infectious diseases at Duke National University of Singapore. And anyway, so I'll have this chat with him, but it's speculative. It is a possibility at the moment, but we were discussing the potential origins of the COVID-19 being Italy. And he's when the global politics allow and the funding makes it possible, he's going to pinpoint the intermediate animal, whether it's the pangolin or the civet cat or whatever. He'll find out using serology testing, very unique kind of serology test that he's developed. So it's going to be interesting what we have to say about present time in the future. And that's what I love about your view and your perspective. You're able to shine new light on things that we have considered the truth, and then maybe it isn't. I mean, I say this to the clients, the dieters that I work with. It's like 10,000 steps a day. Who said? Where did that come from? I mean, that was a marketing ploy developed by a Japanese company trying to sell pedometers. That the Australian government picked up in 2001 or something to encourage us all to move more. But that's not the answer either to the issues of the sort of chronic diseases that we deal with. But you've got that commitment too. By and large, you're trying to leave a legacy well beyond just your time here practicing as a doctor, which, I want to jump straight into the wine doctor and the resveratrol enhanced wine and your love of wine. And you also owned a winery, Pendarves Estate. And where did all that passion come from?
Well, can I just make one comment about COVID before we move on?
Yeah.
From a historic point of view, right? Number one, Professor Holmes, the viral evolutionist at Sydney University, said that this is not a man-made virus because he was the one who released the genome. He said this is a naturally occurring thing, a mutation. It's got to pick an animal that transferred it to humans. That's the thing. And the other thing is, why was it found in sewage in Barcelona in March 2019, which is nearly 2 years ago, long before it was in Wuhan. The other thing is, from a historic point of view, comparing it with the Spanish flu. Back in 1918, the world's population was 1.6 billion. Today it's 7.7 billion. Back then, a third of the population of the world, 500 million people, contracted the disease, and of those, 100 million died. So to put that in perspective, today, if we've got 7.7 billion, a third of that population has to contract it to compete with the Spanish flu. So we're talking 2.5 billion or more people.
Yeah.
And a fifth died. It was a 20% death rate. 100 million people died out of the 500 million. So you've got to be talking about 500 million people dying. Now, where are we? We're at 100 million have contracted it and about 2 million have died. So this is a very, compared with the Spanish flu, it doesn't even rate.
But they didn't have social media back then.
Yeah.
to inflame things.
So in order to compete with the Spanish flu, we've got to have over 500 million cases. 2.5 billion cases and 500 million deaths. And we're only at 2 million deaths. So I think this needs to be put in proper perspective. And also, it's got to be put in proper perspective because we're paying a very high economic price for putting a lid on this thing.
Yes.
Anyway, that's that story. When it comes to wine, I did the PhD on the history of wine as a medicine. So I thought the next thing would be to make wine even healthier. So I sat down and looked at wine from a winemaker's perspective and as a doctor's perspective, and also knowing the OIV rules. The OIV is the Organisation International de Vin, the International Wine control police, whatever you want to call them. So you can't just take some substance and shove it in wine and call it wine. It doesn't work that way. If you did that, it isn't no longer legally wine. It becomes a wine product or a grape product. So the only thing you can tweak is increase in the alcohol. If you do that, it becomes a fortified wine. If you tweak the salicylic acid in wine, it makes the wine very bitter and nobody's going to drink it. So it might be healthier, being an anticoagulant. The salicylic acid is going to taste like shit, and who's going to drink it? So therefore, I tweaked the resveratrol level. And a normal white wine has 1 to 2 milligrams per litre of resveratrol in it. And a red wine, because it's fermented in contact with the grape skins where the resveratrol lives, because the resveratrol is in the grape skin to protect the grape from fungal infection. A red wine is basically fermented with more contact with the grape skin. So you end up with more resveratrol, usually 3 to 6 milligrams per litre. That's why red wines are perceived to be healthier than white. My resveratrol enhanced wine, after my patented technology, is about 100 milligrams per litre. And I've also concentrated it more with a product called Reselixer, which is basically a resveratrol-based wine tonic, to 200 milligrams per litre. And if you had 50 mils of that each day, you get your daily allowance of resveratrol. Now, the other thing to remember about wine is our best preventative medicine. It's our oldest medicine, and it will reduce your death rate by up to 50% if you take it in moderation.
There's a lot of people listening to this right now that are just cheering in the background.
Yes. I'm your savior.
Yeah.
So basically, the Bordeaux study, the American veteran study, there's been quite a few studies that show that if you drank beer, you're similar to teetotalers. If you drink spirits, you can increase your death rate by up to 50%. And if you drink wine, you reduce your death rate by up to 50% because of all its virtues on your vascular system. Now, if you have resveratrol enhanced wine, that's even better. So I promoted the resveratrol and developed it, invented it, whatever you want to call it, resveratrol enhanced wine and Reselixer. And now I'm in the process of trying to sell it. But unfortunately, because of the rules and regulations, you can't extol the health benefits and virtues of it legally. You have to just do it.
So when was it? Just a couple of days ago, I was had a Zoom chat like this with James Mukey, the 2020 Australian of the Year. Now, we were talking about, he's an ophthalmologist, and he, throughout his career, had worked with patients who experience end-stage disease, particularly related to type 2 diabetes. Obviously, it impacts their eyesight. You know, they go to bed one night, they wake up the next day blind. So he's got this, real commitment to educate people on the dangers of the way in which they eat, and we'll get to that in a moment. Sugar in particular, the average Australian consumes about 42 kilograms of sugar every year, which is an extraordinary amount. Anyway, we're talking about some of the issues that are arising is because of a lack of real understanding of the biology. And I express some frustrations with regards to trying to work with dietitians who get their back up and they're very defensive with me. Any time I've spoken to a GP and I ask them, what do you do with your metabolic syndrome patients or your patients that need to lose weight? They say, I refer them to the dietitian. I say, how satisfied are you with the outcomes there? Unequivocally, it's always never satisfied, right? So I'm expressing my frustration to James. He shared with me some of the historical underlying background contexts to the Dietitians Society in Australia, et cetera, which was eye-opening for me. Kind of made me appreciate, okay, where it's all at and why it's that way. Similarly, there's this kind of historical background to the way in which we relate to alcohol. And there's alcohol is considered in many people's view as bad, and there's this polarized view. Something's either bad or it's good, and alcohol is bad. yet everyone does it. So there's this constant experience of guilt. Can you shed some light on the real science, the clinical data, the realities around that?
Yeah, I mean, basically, let's get to the biology. We're going to die, 50% of us are going to die from vascular disease. So vascular disease, not cancer, is the biggest cause of death in first world countries. Either heart attack, stroke, aortic aneurysm, 50% of renal failures because the renal arteries are blocked, peripheral vascular disease, all sorts of manifestations. Now, you have bad cholesterol, and that gets oxidized and deposited in the artery wall, and then that forms a plaque, and eventually the plaque ruptures, and then the body forms a clot to block off the rupture. And that clot is the final event that blocks the artery, and if the artery is a coronary artery or a major artery to the brain, you have a heart attack or stroke. Now, how does wine reduce this? Wine reduces this because it's an antioxidant. So you don't get the oxidation in the vascular tree that causes the deposition of the bad cholesterol in the artery wall in the first place. It reduces bad cholesterol, LDL, or low density lipoprotein. It also raises HDL, or high density lipoprotein, the good cholesterol, which takes cholesterol from the artery wall and back to the liver to be remetabolized. It also acts as an anti-inflammatory, so it prevents the plaque from becoming inflamed and rupturing in the first place. It also acts as an anticoagulant to thin the blood so you don't form clots. So there's 5 ways wine prevents vascular disease. And that's why in the statistics, it reduces heart attacks and strokes by up to 50%. It reduces dementia. One of the causes of dementia is vascular disease, by up to 80%, which is an incredible figure, and everybody ignores it because it's got alcohol in it with the wine.
Yes.
And
There's some
it
more
also,
recent studies that are showing alcohol consumption in mid to late life can even have an impact on
yes,
reducing the
but
onset of dementia.
yeah, but we're talking wine. Alcohol is a different subject. I focus on wine because of the Bordeaux study and all that. I mean, beer is not going to do much harm to you other than if you drink too much of it, you get too much sugar. Spirits should be avoided, but wine is the one that I focus on. Now, if you take your wine in moderation, then you get all the benefits. Obviously not if you abuse it or in excess. Now, you take, there was a study at the end of 2019, mega study where they took on all the, analysed all the studies that have been done over the last couple of decades and came to the conclusion that alcohol was bad for you. And that was done at, Bill Gates sponsored it, and it was done in Seattle at the University of Washington there. Now, if you looked at that study did not divide. It had 2 major flaws. One, it didn't divide alcohol into beer, wine, spirits. It was just alcohol. And number 2, it didn't divide the research into moderate, mild, and abuse. So it didn't quantify how much you were consuming. So if you teased out the wine drinkers who either had it in small amounts or in moderation, you would get health benefits.
But so
Was
what they did was they put together those who would consume a glass of wine with their evening meal every day responsibly, with the group of people that abuse alcohol and consume it in copious amounts, and even the dangerous forms, as you're saying, spirits, right? So
yeah. So this mega analysis never teased out the different types of alcohol and the different rates of consumption. So I, in my blog site, bagged the shit out of the study because it's flawed. It is flawed and shouldn't be given coverage. But when it came out, it was everywhere. And
yes.
everyone was saying, oh, alcohol's bad for you, blah, blah, blah. No, it isn't. And if you read my book or you read my PhD on my website, you will realize, as I said, it's our oldest medicine, it's our most documented medicine, and it's our best preventative medicine. And I'll stake my reputation on that. In the good old days, what were you going to die from? You were going to die from infected water or some sort of infection, right? Now, if Jesus converting the water into wine, probably saved everybody from dying from gastroenteritis back in his day. So in the ancient world, infection was the biggest cause of death. And wine would be the thing that purified the water, purified the wound, purified the food. Today, the biggest cause of death is vascular disease. And as I said, there's 5 different ways it reduces vascular disease. When it comes to dementia, it also prevents inflammation that affects the DNA of a cell and therefore helps prevent cancers, such as a 50% reduction in the cancer of the prostate. Now, it can increase cancer of the gut if you're drinking alcohol in the form of spirits and you're abusing it. So you can get cancer of the stomach, the esophagus, the bowel, and the liver. But I'm not talking about spirits and I'm not talking about abuse. I'm talking wine in moderation. And when it comes to dementia, it also reduces the inflammation and damage to neurons or nerve cells. So that it's one of the mechanisms for reducing dementia along with the vascular benefits. Also, they're now showing that it helps with other forms of neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's disease.
Yeah.
So wine, and particularly resveratrol enhanced wine, has great medicinal virtue.
Yeah, I remember reading a study. It was done in rodents, but they were examining the cardiovascular protective benefits and inflammatory reducing benefits of resveratrol, and the study suggested that to a large part the mode of action was from modulating the gut microbiome. So, I mean, it's such a beautiful story, the way that these plants, when they're stressed, increase these protective molecules that when consumed by mammals, they have this sort of survival benefit to them in so many different ways. From what you've covered, the antioxidant benefits, the anti-inflammatory benefits. There's also the activation of some of these survival genes that Professor David Sinclair, has detailed quite extensively. But just to let you know, so just for the viewers, I've been experimenting, right, in modifying the sort of dietary approach and seeing what was possible on myself, experimenting on myself. I was trying to answer this question: can I increase the rate of fat loss and at the same time build muscle mass? And how rapidly can I do that? So, you and I have been speaking and you guided me on taking the Res Elixir, the resveratrol enhanced wine, the super concentrated stuff, in a small dose daily. I included that in. Now, my thinking is that would probably aid in enhancing mitochondrial number in my muscle cells as well, to help increase the rate of growth. And anyway, here's what happened. In a 14-day period, I previously had pushed my body fat percentage up to 20.8% body fat. And my visceral fat score on the Tanita scale was 7.5. So for everyone else, that's the fat inside my internal organs. And in a 14-day period, my body fat percentage went from 20.6 or something like that, 20.8 to 15.5% body fat. I'd lost 4 kilograms of fat mass. I also gained 1.65 kilograms of muscle. So there you go. I think, the addition of the resveratrol in that context contributed to those results. So, I'll be looking at adding that with all of the clients under your guidance. Obviously, as you say, it's got to be taken responsibly and in the right dose, and it's all about context, temporality, and dose, right? So a lot of people don't consider dose.
Well, the father of modern pharmacology, Paracelsus, said the only problem with alcohol is dose. If you take too much, it's abused, it's bad for you. If you take it in the right dose, it's good for you.
Yeah, and that's the difference between a medicine and poison.
Yes, the difference between a medicine and a poison is dosage. Um, the other thing about resveratrol is its absorption. Now, people take it as pills and capsules and all that sort of thing, so it has to go through the stomach into the small bowel to be absorbed. Then it goes through the portal system to the liver, where it gets metabolized before it goes out into the bloodstream again. Now, if you take it as in wine and stick it in your mouth and just swill it around the mouth for a minute or so, tasting the wine and enjoying the wine before you swallow, it gets absorbed through the buccal mucosa or the lining of the mouth directly into the blood system. And that increases the absorption by a factor of up to 250. So the best way to absorb resveratrol is not as a pill or a capsule, but as wine swilled around inside your mouth, enjoying the flavor and the texture of the wine before you swallow.
I mean, just to put that into context for people, it's, when Sertris was developed and had all these analogs of resveratrol, there's a biotech company, it was worth about $140 million on the NASDAQ. And GlaxoSmithKline, this big pharmaceutical company, comes in and buys the patents for $720 million. And they couldn't figure out how to deliver the molecule to the diabetic patients because of the low bioavailability, the mechanisms that you just detailed. And the best delivery medium seems it was figured out 9,500 years ago, right? That was when wine was developed. Was it 9,500 years ago?
Yes, wine was developed in China. Well, the earliest we know is China, a place called Yuan on the Yellow River 9,500 years ago. And then the next place that developed it was Georgia, which everybody thinks Georgia is where wine began. No, it began in China. But it's an interesting thing. Wine is a complex uh, drink, and our body is a complex system. And we still don't appreciate how complex and how good our body is. And we just spend the rest of our life buggering it up.
Yes. Well, look, I think it's being able to bring the historical aspects to what we're dealing with in modern day times and the kind of health challenges that people deal with. And, you've got not only the longevity of medical practice under your belt, but you've seen the people under your medical guidance develop throughout their entire life, start families and all the way into their elderly years. And you still you still look after the elderly, is that correct?
Yeah, I still old-fashioned GP, still doing house calls, and there's plenty of elderly patients that can't get to the surgery or get to hospital, so I'd visit them, and I visit 6 nursing homes.
Yeah.
In 3 of those nursing homes, I have half the patients because nobody else visits. Unfortunately, the new doctors, I don't call them GPs. A proper GP does house calls and visits nursing homes. I call them MCPs, medical centre princesses. And the medical centre princesses or medical centre princes don't do house calls. They just stay in their little medical centre and then go off to their Pilates class afterwards. So they're not true GPs, they're MCPs, medical centre princesses.
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot to be said in that the commitment to care for one another and really be willing to put our backsides on the line for other people having the lives that they really want. So, I think there's thousands of people that throughout your lifetime can thank you for that. Mate, we deal with at Simplr Health, obviously, the commitment is to impact metabolic syndrome. A lot of people, A, don't know what that is. B, don't understand that it's the underlying kind of, hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance is one of the underlying factors to all the 5 major causes of death and of chronic disease. And a lot of people even relate to type 2 diabetes as something, oh, we can just control it with diet, but it's not that bloody simple. There's like dire consequences. And we were talking about, you were sharing with me inconsequential kids. And I thought that was fascinating because there's that way of being that it's kind of extends. It's like not just limited to those kids, but why don't you talk a little bit about those kids that you were sharing with me about? And then this is what adults need to be aware of, responsible for in terms of their own health and well-being, because we've got to prevent people from having, all these issues, kidney disease and strokes and heart attacks, etc. And it can be easily avoided if they're responsible and they understand the consequences of their actions.
Yeah, well, as I said, the commonest thing is vascular disease, heart attacks and strokes, but people don't appreciate renal failure, for example. Now, renal failure, if you're blocking off your renal artery or its branches, the kidney doesn't work, and hence you'd go into renal failure. So you should be calling that a kidney attack.
Yes.
If we're going to call it a heart attack, it should be called a kidney attack. But people don't realize that 50% of renal failure is vascular as well. Now, getting back to the inconsequential kids, what was happening in Northern Ireland was they were getting lots of young kids going to casualty after being run over by cars. So there were lots of leg injuries and head injuries, etc. And one of the people in casualty said, why are all these kids being run over by cars? And he studied them and he came to the conclusion that they weren't worried about the consequences of their actions. So if they kicked the soccer ball onto the road, they'd chase the ball onto the road, not worrying about the consequences of running onto the road, like being run over by a car. And he said, why is this? Why aren't they learning the consequences of their actions? And then he analysed their diet. Their diet was full of carbohydrates, in other words, chips and McDonald's and all this sort of thing, and very low in protein. And protein is necessary not only for building muscles and all that for your skeleton, it's also necessary for laying down memory. So he got a campaign together where they gave them a high protein meal at lunchtime in these schools. So they got fed lots of protein, which they were lacking in their diet. They started to have memory. Their memory told them, don't go running on the road, because last time I did that, I got run over. And so the rate of these children presenting to casualty dropped significantly, and everyone was happy. So the inconsequential kids were the consequence of having a low protein, high carbohydrate diet. And what we're encouraging people to do now is have a high protein, low carbohydrate, low fat diet.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fantastic. I mean, I saw that. I remember I came and visited you in your surgery, and I was driving home and I turned right into this intersection. And it's not at the actual crossing, but there was this young man crossing the road, and I had to slam the brakes on. I beeped the horn, and he was on his mobile phone. He would have been about 18, 19 years of age. And he was walking across the road. You and I, that would have scared the shit out of us. I would have jumped and scuttled across the road. He just casually looked up at me and then just turned back to his phone and just kept walking at that same pace. Like it's like there was no realization that if a car hit him, it would actually hurt, you know? And I'm thinking, well, there's this whole generation that's growing up on a high sugar diet, plus it's confounded by the amount of screen time. So brains just aren't developing appropriately. And these are the ones that are going to inherit the planet and,
And then
make
they're
the
going to
leadership decisions.
and then they're going to develop digital amnesia. In other words, because they're just pushing buttons, they're going to forget telephone numbers, people's names, all that sort of thing, because it's a button. We'll push a button. If you said to them, well, what's that person's name? What's their job? What's their role? What's their actual telephone number? They wouldn't have a clue. So that's a big problem called digital amnesia. And also, if you talk to psychologists, we're raising a whole bunch of children who are very insecure and very hedonistic. It's all about them. It's all about me. Very selfish. I don't think I want to be around in that world. Okay, so these guys have got to start being selfless and thinking about their fellow man.
Yeah, exactly. Well, obviously nutrition is going to play a big part in that. And, 1 in 4 children now overweight. It's a third of the adult population are obese. That same number is at least overweight. So it's a big issue. And, I just really thank and appreciate you for working with me on this commitment and offering all the guidance that you do. And if anyone wants to get any further information on Dr. Norrie and his efforts, please visit drnorrie.info. You can also, through that website, access his blog. And also you can find out more information about The Wine Doctor on thewinedoctor.com.au and purchase our products there. We've got some Shiraz. There's two different kinds of Barossa Valley Shiraz, and there's also the more concentrated form Res Elixir that we were discussing before. Is there anything else that you'd like to share or say that we may have missed? We can do another one of these in time, but if there's anything else you want to say.
Well, the father of modern medicine is Hippocrates, right? Because Hippocrates is the first physician to say that you were sick because there's something wrong with you, not because you'd incurred the wrath of the gods, right? This is 2,300 years ago. And he said that basically you are what you eat. Okay, so if it's good enough for Hippocrates, it's good enough for us. He basically said, you are what you eat. If you eat a healthy diet, you'll be obviously healthier than if you eat a lousy diet, okay? And he also said wine is fit for man in a wonderful way, provided it's taken with good sense by the sick as well as the healthy.
Love it. Awesome. Really appreciate it, Phil. We'll speak soon.
Okay.